In the rolling, mist-covered hills of Tennessee in the year 1852, there stood a farmhouse built of rough timber and stone, a dwelling not unlike many others of its time, yet fated to bear witness to a birth that would never be forgotten, a night when heaven and earth seemed to lean in closer to watch, and when the line between blessing and curse blurred so thoroughly that no one who saw it would ever be able to speak of it without lowering their voice. For on that storm-lashed evening, Margaret Holloway, wife of Thomas Holloway, a farmer whose family had tilled that soil for generations, was delivered of twin daughters whose very first cries carried something uncanny, something that unsettled even the most hardened midwife in the county. The wind tore at the shutters as rain streaked the windows in crooked rivers. Thunder rolled low across the hills like the growl of some distant beast, and the oil lamps flickered, though no draught stirred the room. Yet when the babies slid into the world, they did not wail in the piercing manner of most newborns, but instead released sounds that layered over one another, voices that seemed to echo as though one belonged to the living and one belonged to something else, something that walked just outside the light of that room. And the midwife, a woman named Agnes Withers who had delivered more than 50 children in her years, crossed herself and whispered that no good would come from two infants who cried with such resonance, as though they had been born already answering one another, already bound to a secret vow. Margaret, exhausted and drenched in sweat, swore she saw the candle flames bend toward the cradle as the girls were wrapped in linen and placed side by side, and though she was a practical woman, one who rose before dawn to churn butter and who had no time for fanciful talk, she admitted later to her sister that in that moment, whole, and though no one could point to any act of malice or wrongdoing on the part of the twins, the sense that they belonged more to mystery than to ordinary life made even kind-hearted folk cross themselves when the girls passed by. Still, within their own family, Clara and Eliza thrived, pale but graceful children with long lashes and dark eyes that gleamed with a strange intelligence. Their laughter would spill across the hollows in notes so sweet and light that anyone listening might have thought angels themselves were singing, but to others the very same sound carried an undertone, something too perfect, too inhuman, and thus unsettling. As they grew, their bond only deepened. If one reached for a toy, the other's hand would already be upon it. If one fell and scraped her knee, the other flinched and cried out in pain though untouched. And when they began to speak, they learned words not in staggered steps but together, uttering phrases in unison, finishing sentences as if their thoughts were not two streams, but one river flowing through two mouths. Their mother, torn between wonder and fear, tried to guide them gently, reminding them that they were children, not apparitions, but late at night, when she watched them sleeping in the same bed with hands clasped tightly, she sometimes wondered whether they dreamed the same dream, whether their souls might wander in tandem through landscapes unseen. And thus the Holloway sisters entered childhood, watched with suspicion by their neighbors and with trembling awe by their family, leaving behind a trail of whispers wherever they went. For though they had done nothing yet to harm, the world around them seemed to bend and quiver as if adjusting to the presence of two beings who had not been born merely into life, but into legend, a legend that even in its first chapter was already written in shadow and bound in silence. By the time Clara and Eliza Holloway reached their 15th year, the hills of Tennessee had grown heavy with the weight of their names, for superstition, like ivy on an abandoned wall, had wrapped itself around every story, every sighting, every whispered account of the sisters, so that even those who claimed not to believe found themselves glancing twice when they passed, their hands twitching toward pockets where they carried charms against evil. The Holloway twins had not sought this reputation, for they had never spoken a cruel word or struck a cruel hand against anyone, but strangeness clung to them as persistently as shadows clung to the valley at dusk, and the valley folk, who were steeped in faith and fear in equal measure, could not look upon two girls who mirrored one another so perfectly without sensing that something unnatural had taken root. Farmers muttered that their corn turned brittle after the sisters passed their fields, that cows gave blood instead of milk in the mornings after their laughter had carried across the ridge. Mothers drew their children closer when Clara and Eliza walked into town, muttering hurried prayers beneath their breath, while one preacher, Reverend Josiah McGraw, declared from the pulpit that these two souls were knit together not by the hand of the Lord, but by some darker weaver, and they are not meant to be parted by man's hand, nor God's, words that stirred both awe and fear. For in the American South of 1867, a preacher's voice carried not just weight, but the air of divine finality. What unsettled people most was not any act of malice from the sisters, but the way their bodies mirrored each other as if they were not two lives at all, but one life doubled, split into two forms. When Clara caught a fever, her body burning and trembling in the night, Eliza, who had not been near her, began to sweat and cry out in delirium too. Physicians came from Nashville and beyond, men in coats carrying stethoscopes and ink-stained notebooks, and they examined the girls with earnest curiosity, tapping their knees, studying their pulses, whispering their observations. Yet in the end, every physician left shaking his head, unable to explain what he had seen except to write words like sympathetic resonance or unprecedented bond, terms that explained nothing and satisfied no one, leaving the community to supply its own explanations, which ranged from witchcraft to the belief that the Holloway family was under some generational curse, punishment for a sin so terrible that the Lord had seen fit to bind the daughters in chains of mirrored flesh. As Clara and Eliza entered young womanhood, their strangeness only deepened, for they grew into hauntingly beautiful figures, their raven-black hair falling in waves, their skin pale as frost even beneath the harsh Tennessee sun, their eyes dark pools that reflected not just light, but seemed to drink it in. Men brought flowers, carved trinkets, poems scribbled on torn paper, standing nervously at the Holloway gate as though approaching an altar, but the longer they lingered, the more unsettled they became, for the sisters did not giggle and blush like ordinary girls, but instead regarded their admirers with an intensity that was too much for the heart, and when they spoke, they often did so in unison, finishing one another's sentences in voices that blended seamlessly into one sound, as if the words had not been spoken by two throats, but had emerged from some shared and unseen source. Many a young man, stirred by their beauty, left within days, shaken and pale, muttering excuses, unable to describe why his stomach turned cold in their presence, but unwilling to return. Their father, Thomas Holloway, though once a man of broad shoulders and certain steps, began to stoop. The day of the Holloway Sisters' funeral dawned beneath skies that seemed unwilling to part with light, heavy black clouds pressing low over the Tennessee hills, as if the heavens themselves mourned or recoiled from what was about to be consigned to the earth. And though funerals in those hills were normally gatherings of both grief and communion, where hymns were sung and neighbors offered comfort, the burial of Clara and Eliza was different. Cloaked not in consolation, but in a silence so taut it felt like the valley itself was holding its breath. For no birds sang in the branches, no dogs barked from the farms, not even the wind stirred the grass, and every man, woman, and child who came to stand at the edges of Holloway soil did so with a look not only of sadness but of dread, as though they feared that even proximity to the sisters' final rites might mark them with some lingering curse. The two girls lay in a single coffin, for Thomas and Margaret had insisted they be buried as they had lived, hand in hand, side by side, inseparable in death as in life, and though the carpenter who built the coffin admitted in hushed tones that he had measured it twice, for he could not shake the sensation that when he nailed the lid shut, the wood gave back a muffled echo, like the sound of something within answering back. He said nothing aloud, only worked quickly and crossed himself as he left the Holloway house that morning. The procession to the family plot was short but haunted. The preacher, Reverend McGraw, whose fire and brimstone warnings had once condemned the sisters as unholy, now muttered verses with trembling lips, his voice stripped of thunder, as if even he feared to speak too loudly over their remains, while the townsfolk stood at a distance, clustering like sheep beyond the fence line, unwilling to step closer, though their curiosity held them fast. Rumors passed by. Others swore they saw twin shadows moving across the headstones, slender figures hand in hand, though no living body cast them, and more than one man stumbled home pale as chalk, unable to speak of what he had glimpsed save to mutter that the sisters were not gone, not truly gone. Years passed, yet the legend only deepened. Storms that tore across the valley always seemed to send lightning into one place, the Holloway grave, splitting the sky again and again above it, so that some nights the hill glowed with fire from the heavens, and the townsfolk whispered that the girls drew the storms to them, that their restless spirits summoned the crack of thunder to remind the living they were still waiting, still watching. The Holloway farmhouse, once bustling with family life, slowly rotted into ruin as grief hollowed out its walls just as surely as vines and rain did, the windows breaking, the porch collapsing, until it stood like a skeleton of timber among the weeds, a husk of memory no one dared approach after nightfall. Yet the legend endured, Parents warned their children not to wander near the burial ground, for it was said those who tarried too long returned not quite themselves, pale, feverish, whispering in voices that came in pairs, as though two tones had climbed inside their throats, echoing Clara and Eliza from beneath the earth. One boy, stubborn and bold, dared his friends to sleep by the grave one summer evening. He was found at dawn shaking violently, his lips moving in two distinct voices at once, neither of them his own, and though he lived, he never spoke again, only mouthed silent words to the shadows as if conversing with unseen companions. And so, the tale of Clara and Eliza Holloway became more than memory. It became a warning etched into the land itself, a story mothers told at the hearth to still the chatter of children, a story preachers alluded to.